Of the 12 spies who went into the land to examine it, 10 of them came back saying that they could not take the land. Only Caleb and Joshua insisted that the promised land was theirs for the taking. And it was not because of their power, but because of their God. His promise guaranteed this land to them. Well, in chapter 14, we see that the lies of these gutless spies have now spread through the entire nation like poison. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Isn't it interesting that the men say, effectively, we should disobey God for the sake of our wives and children? I mean, what twisted logic is that? We should go back to Egypt and then we will be safe? Can you imagine for a moment, given all that's transpired between Israel and Egypt, can you imagine the greeting they would receive from the Egyptians if they came back now? The leader's response here is a wonderful example to us. Moses and Aaron get to praying, and Caleb and Joshua try persuading. They are not swayed by the sinful perspective of the people. They are not paralyzed by fear or helplessness. Instead, they get to work, doing what they can. Essentially, some praying, some preaching. It is the old pastor's toolkit, praying and preaching. They are trying to shepherd this unruly, rebellious flock. Now, despite their best efforts and this powerful speech, verse 10, the whole assembly talked about stoning them. And so at this point, God steps in. He says to Moses that he will send a plague through the people and destroy them all, and then he will start again. He will keep his promises to Moses, but he'll make Moses into the father of a great nation. Now just think for a moment of the ways in which that might appeal to you if you were Moses. You can get rid of all of these complainers at once, and you will become the father of the family of God. You will be remembered as the fountain of God's family. You'll be like Abraham when people look back upon the history of Israel. There's no way in your lifetime that you'll ever have to deal with the problems of leading a massive nation like this again. Your family won't ever grow to be that big in your lifetime. This is a way out of all his problems, it seems. He doesn't have to shepherd these sheep. He doesn't have to lead this nation. All he has to do is be the father of this family. How about it, Moses? Just to let you in on what I think God is doing here, he's proposing a scenario to Moses that will draw out his heart. You see Moses take up exactly the position you would want him to take up as a godly, loving leader of the people. He's not selfish here. He's selfless. He thinks of them rather than thinking of him. What does he do? He cries out to God for the forgiveness of these sinners. And as he does, he appeals to the highest possible motivation, the very glory of God. He says, for the sake of love and forgiveness and for your own glory, please, will you forgive them? It is a wonderful insight into the man that Moses has become. And I believe that God was setting the stage for him to play that part in that moment. And he does it perfectly, doesn't he? The chapter ends with God forgiving his people, yes, but laying out for them clearly that sin always carries consequences. That is how dangerous, how serious sin is. They will not enter the promised land anymore. Anyone 20 years or older will die in the wilderness, but their children will live and enter the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb are the exceptions to that rule. They will live long enough because they had faith and were not ruled over by fear. Unsurprisingly, the people are grieved again. They know they've blown it now. Their chance to enter the promised land has gone. That ship has sailed. But they do not learn their lesson. As we read verse 42, they now are going to ignore what God has just said, and they are going to try and enter the promised land anyway. I mean, he's just told you, you can't and you won't. It's like jumping into the water after the boat has gone. You've missed it. Again, it might look like faith motivating these actions, but it's not. It's disobedience. And so we read verse 44, "Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up to the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah." This chapter ends by showing us that sin is serious and it does have consequences. Even now, even for Christians who are truly forgiven, there are consequences for sin. If you are a Christian, nothing can separate you from the love of God. You are saved. There is no punishment left for you to bear. But there is still discipline for you to learn from. If you go out and commit horrific crime today, well, don't be surprised that there are consequences. Your family will suffer because of that decision. Your future will be affected by that decision. Sin is never a small thing, even for those who belong to God. And so we should flee from it at all costs.